I am William Crawford, 65 years old, and I spent my entire life building a solid foundation so my son would never have to know the bitter sting of poverty. I poured $600,000 of my own hard-earned cash into his luxury cosmetic dental clinic. When I finally called his wife to ask what time I should arrive for the grand opening ceremony, she laughed. She told me it happened 6 weeks ago. She said my blue-collar aesthetic did not really match their high-end brand. 3 days later, she called back in an absolute panic because the equipment suppliers were threatening to shut their entire operation down. She demanded to know if I had sent the rest of the money. I just smiled into the receiver. I told her I do not fund strangers, and I hung up the phone. Before I tell you exactly how I legally dismantled their entire fake empire from the ground up, let me know what city you are listening from in the comments below. Hit that like button and subscribe if you believe arrogance should always come with a massive, unavoidable receipt. My kitchen table is made of solid oak. I built it myself 30 years ago, and its surface is covered in deep scratches and gouges from decades of rolling out construction blueprints and reviewing commercial real estate contracts. On a quiet Tuesday morning, that worn wooden surface served as the resting place for a single crisp piece of paper. It was a bank wire confirmation receipt. The number printed at the bottom was exactly $600,000. I sat in the silent kitchen staring at the 9 digits that represented years of breathing in drywall dust, pouring concrete in the freezing rain, and working 70-hour weeks. I had liquidated a significant portion of my private portfolio to fund this venture. My son Bradley had just completed his residency and was opening a state-of-the-art cosmetic dental clinic in the most expensive commercial district in the city. I felt a profound sense of pride swelling in my chest. I had broken my back so he could wear custom-tailored scrubs and transform smiles for a living. The grand opening was supposed to be this month. I had purchased a new charcoal gray suit specifically for the occasion, hanging it carefully on the back of my bedroom door so the wrinkles would fall out. I wiped a speck of dust off the bank receipt, picked up my heavy scuffed smartphone, and dialed Bradley's house. I just wanted to know what time I needed to show up to watch my son cut the ribbon on his future. The phone rang 4 times before Monica answered. My daughter-in-law always spoke with a forced, breathy tone that she likely copied from daytime television socialites. I asked her warmly how the final preparations for the clinic were going and what time I should arrive for the opening celebration this weekend. A sharp, uncomfortable silence stretched across the line. When she finally spoke, her voice was dripping with a cold, condescending edge. She sighed heavily, as if my phone call was an unbearable interruption to her morning routine. She told me that the grand opening had already happened 6 weeks ago. I sat perfectly still in my wooden chair. I asked her to repeat herself, thinking my hearing was finally failing me. Monica did not apologize. Instead, she leaned into her cruelty. She explained that they only invited close family and friends, people who truly understood the vision of the brand. She told me that the clinic catered to high-net-worth individuals, local celebrities, and corporate executives. Then she delivered the words that severed our family ties forever. She said that while they appreciated the financial gift, my overall aesthetic just did not match the curated vibe they were trying to project to the local media. She explicitly stated that an old man in flannel shirts and work boots walking around their pristine marble lobby would confuse their target demographic. She actually suggested that my presence would have been an embarrassment to Bradley on his big day. She talked for several minutes, rambling about brand synergy, exclusive guest lists, and how hard she had worked to hire the right catering company for the ribbon cutting. She justified cutting me out of the most important day of my son's professional life by framing it as a necessary marketing decision. She never once acknowledged the $600,000 that paid for the very floor she stood on. To Monica, my money was just an unearned entitlement, a basic obligation that I owed them for the privilege of being associated with her rising social status. She finished her monologue by telling me she had to go because her personal Pilates instructor had just arrived. She told me we could grab a quick coffee sometime next month if her schedule cleared up. The line went completely dead. I pulled the phone away from my ear and set it down softly on the oak table. I did not throw the phone against the wall. I did not scream. I did not call Bradley to demand an explanation or cry about my broken heart. Tears and shouting are the weapons of the powerless. I embraced absolute suffocating silence. The realization washed over me like freezing water. The son I had sacrificed my youth to protect viewed me as a disposable resource, a bank account without a face. I stood up from the table. My knees popped, a permanent reminder of the roofing jobs I took in my 30s to pay for his private school tuition. I walked down the short hallway to my home office. The room smelled of old paper leather and quiet discipline. I approached the heavy fireproof steel safe bolted to the floor in the corner of the room. I slowly spun the mechanical dial, entering the combination with practiced precision. The heavy steel door clicked and swung open. I reached past my personal files and pulled out a thick, black leather binder. It was not a photo album. It was a collection of legally binding commercial agreements. Bradley and Monica believed I had simply given them a massive cash gift. They assumed I was an unsophisticated blue-collar worker who blindly handed over his retirement savings. They did not know that I had used that $600,000 to purchase the clinic's commercial building through a blind corporate entity. They did not know that every single piece of expensive dental machinery in that building was leased through my private holding company. I flipped through the heavy parchment pages, tracing my finger over the master lease agreement. I closed the binder, placed it squarely on my desk, and waited for the inevitable. Exactly 72 hours later, my phone vibrated against the kitchen table. The caller ID flashed Monica's name. I let it ring 3 times before I answered. The breathy, condescending socialite was completely gone. In her place was a frantic, hyperventilating woman bordering on sheer panic. She did not bother to say hello. She immediately demanded to know if I had wired the remaining operating capital to the clinic's primary account. Her voice cracked as she explained that the main equipment supplier was threatening to halt all operations. The high-end contractors who installed the marble lobby were threatening to file a mechanic's lien against the business by the end of the day. The bills were massively past due. She yelled into the phone asking why the secondary wire transfer had not cleared my bank yet. The sheer arrogance of her entitlement was staggering. She had barred me from the opening, insulted my entire existence, and yet she fully expected me to blindly fund the consequences of her reckless spending. She told me that Bradley had patients booked for the afternoon, and that a disruption in service would ruin their flawless online reputation. I let her talk until she literally ran out of breath. I listened to the desperation clawing at her throat. When the line finally fell quiet, I spoke in a voice so calm and measured, it seemed to drop the temperature in the room. I told her that she was absolutely right about my aesthetic. I agreed that my old work boots did not belong in her pristine lobby. Then I informed her that my bank account did not fit her brand either. I told her I do not fund strangers, and I certainly do not fund tenants who fail to respect their landlords. Monica stammered, confused by the word tenant, but before she could formulate a single question, I ended the call. I blocked her number immediately. I walked back into my office, picked up the black leather binder, and dialed the private number of Jonathan Reed, the most ruthless corporate attorney in the state. It was time to show them who really owned the ground they walked on. It took exactly 47 minutes for the aggressive roar of an imported engine to shatter the quiet afternoon of my neighborhood. I sat in my living room armchair watching through the front window as Bradley drove his sleek black sports car up my gravel driveway. He did not park with any care or respect for my property. He slammed on the brakes, sending a shower of loose stones against the side of my wooden porch. He threw the heavy car door open and slammed it shut with enough force to rattle the glass in my window panes. He marched up the wooden steps, not bothering to knock. He shoved his way through the front door, bringing the chaotic and frantic energy of his collapsing world directly into my quiet home. Bradley was dressed in his custom-tailored designer scrubs, the fabric perfectly pressed, his hair styled with meticulous precision, but his face was flushed a deep, ugly shade of crimson. The veins in his neck stood out against his skin. He did not greet me. He did not ask how I was doing. He immediately began pacing the length of my worn living room rug like a caged animal, his expensive leather loafers slapping aggressively against the floorboards. He pointed a trembling finger at me and demanded to know what kind of sick game I was playing with his wife. He yelled that Monica had been inconsolable for the past hour, terrified that their high society friends would find out about the clinic facing financial strain. He stopped pacing for a fraction of a second, just long enough to lean over my coffee table and order me to authorize the secondary wire transfer immediately. He spoke to me not as a father who had sacrificed everything for his success, but as a disobedient subordinate who had failed to execute a simple task. His monologue escalated rapidly, from demands to outright insults. He told me that I was actively sabotaging my own financial investment out of petty and small-minded jealousy. He actually had the audacity to claim that I was punishing him just because I did not get a VIP pass to a meaningless social event. He waved his arms frantically, describing the absolute humiliation he would face if the equipment suppliers came to reclaim the dental chairs while his wealthy patients were sitting in the waiting room. He kept using the phrase, his money. He demanded his money. He told me that the $600,000 I had already provided was just the beginning, a necessary seed fund that I was obligated to see through to the very end. He paced back toward the front window, ranting about how hard he had worked to build his personal brand. He talked about his medical degree as if he had forged it out of thin air, completely, ignoring the decades of sweat and pouring concrete that had paid every single cent of his university tuition. He laughed a bitter, hollow laugh, gesturing wildly at my living room. He asked me what I was even saving my money for, living in a house that had not been updated since the 1990s. He demanded to know why I was hoarding wealth when he, the actual professional in the family, needed it to solidify his legacy. He told me that my stubbornness was going to bankrupt him before he even had a chance to shine. He looked around my modest home, sneering at the faded wallpaper and the old furniture, and declared that I clearly had no understanding of how high-level corporate finance worked. He stood directly in front of my chair, crossing his arms over his chest, projecting an aura of absolute superiority. He gave me a final ultimatum. He told me to pick up my phone call, my wealth manager, and release the remaining operating capital before the end of the business day. He promised that if I simply wired the funds and stopped acting like a senile old man, he would forgive my little outburst with Monica and perhaps let me come take a tour of the clinic after hours when the important clients were gone. He stood there breathing heavily, waiting for me to apologize and comply. I remained perfectly still in my worn armchair. I did not raise my voice to match his frantic, chaotic energy. Instead, I looked closely at the stranger standing in my living room. I looked at the immaculate, precise stitching on his custom-tailored scrubs. I noticed the expensive designer watch gleaming on his wrist, a piece of jewelry that likely cost more than my first truck. Then I looked down at my own hands resting quietly on my knees. The contrast was staggering. My knuckles were permanently swollen from decades of blunt force impact. Thick, heavy calluses covered my palms, and the skin was deeply scarred from countless burns and cuts. They were the undeniable physical receipts of the life I had traded to build his. I spoke quietly, my voice steady and cold. I asked him if he remembered the summer of his sophomore year of college. Bradley rolled his eyes dramatically, letting out a loud, exasperated sigh. He snapped that he did not have the time or the patience for one of my pathetic, nostalgic lectures about the good old days. He said his business was collapsing, and he needed capital, not a trip down memory lane. I looked him dead in the eye and told him it was not a nostalgic lecture. It was a precise financial audit. I reminded my son that while he was spending that entire sweltering summer attending elite fraternity mixers and weekend boat parties, I was working 70-hour weeks pouring industrial concrete for the new county bridge. I painted the picture for him, stripping away his convenient amnesia. I detailed the brutal July heat explaining how the sun would bake the sweat and chemical dust into my work clothes until they were stiff as cardboard. I reminded him that I woke up at 4 in the morning every single day, destroying the cartilage in my knees so I could write the massive checks for his out-of-state undergraduate tuition. I made it absolutely clear that he walked into his expensive dental residency completely free of student debt, because I spent a decade breaking my own body to keep the banks away from his door. I told him that the smooth, privileged path he was currently strutting on was paved entirely with my exhausted spine. Bradley did not lower his head in shame. He did not show a single ounce of gratitude or self-awareness. Instead, his face twisted into an ugly, mocking sneer. He took a step closer to my chair, looking down his nose at me. He had the absolute audacity to claim that every parent makes sacrifices and that I was simply weaponizing basic parental duties to justify holding his clinic hostage. I calmly corrected his deeply flawed logic. I told him that basic parenting is providing food, shelter, and a safe home. Pouring concrete until I was coughing up gray dust, just so he could afford luxury dormitories and not have to take out a single student loan, was not basic parenting. It was a massive voluntary luxury investment. He scoffed loudly, waving his hand in the air to dismiss my entire life of work. He told me that manual labor was my own poor choice. He actually stated that my inability to climb the corporate ladder or make smart, sophisticated investments early in my life was a personal failure, not a burden he should have to carry. He looked at my faded flannel shirt with open disgust. He declared that my dirty concrete money was simply a necessary stepping stone for his superior intellectual potential. He told me that a man with an advanced medical degree and a high society network operates on a completely different financial plane than a retired, simple-minded construction worker. I listened to his incredibly toxic words, feeling the very last remaining threads of my parental sympathy permanently evaporate into the room. He truly believed he had manifested his own success through sheer personal brilliance. He saw my worn clothes and assumed I was a foolish, powerless old man who had blindly given away his entire life savings. He pointed a manicured finger toward the kitchen, demanding that I stop crying about ancient history and recognize who was in charge now. He yelled that he was the absolute future of the Crawford family name. He insisted that my $600,000 was nothing more than a minor down payment on his inevitable empire, and that if I did not release the remaining funds immediately, I was deliberately destroying the only valuable thing my miserable life had ever produced. I let his arrogant words hang in the heavy air of my living room. I did not interrupt his childish tantrum. When he finally ran out of breath and stood there waiting for my surrender, I reached down and picked up the thick black leather binder I had retrieved from my fireproof safe. I placed it gently on the coffee table right in front of his expensive leather loafers. I opened the heavy cover and slid a thick stack of stapled legal documents across the smooth wood until the paper touched his kneecap. I told him to pick it up. He looked down at the documents with a mixture of annoyance and confusion, still firmly believing that I was just a foolish old man clinging to outdated concepts of respect. He snatched the papers off the table, ready to tear them apart and throw them back in my face. I told him to read the name printed boldly at the top of the very first page. He scanned the document, his eyes darting back and forth across the legal jargon. I watched his brow furrow as he read the words, Apex Commercial Holdings. He aggressively asked me what this garbage was, complaining loudly that he did not have time for my amateur business schemes while his clinic was facing a financial crisis. I kept my voice incredibly soft and steady. I explained that Apex Commercial Holdings was a blind corporate trust that I established entirely on my own 3 months ago. I told him that the $600,000 I provided was never a direct cash deposit into his personal bank account. I explained that I am not a silent minority partner in his little cosmetic dental startup. I used that exact sum of money to purchase the commercial building housing his clinic outright. I am the sole managing director of the holding trust. I let that absolute legal reality wash over him. I told him that he does not own the walls. He does not own the pristine marble floors Monica spent so much time bragging about. He does not own the ceiling, the doors, or the private parking lot. He is simply a commercial tenant, and his lease is entirely dependent on my continued goodwill. The arrogant red flush began to drain rapidly from Bradley's face, replaced by a sickly pale white. He swallowed hard, staring at the property deed bearing my corporate signature. He tried to stammer out a defense, claiming that even if I owned the building, the clinic itself was still his. He said he owned the medical practice, the state business license, and the advanced medical equipment that generated the actual revenue. He desperately clung to the illusion of his own independence, trying to convince himself that he still had the upper hand. I reached into the leather binder again and pulled out a second stack of documents. I slid this one across the table right next to his trembling hands. I told him to read the master equipment lease agreement. I did not raise my voice, but every single word I spoke was a calculated and devastating strike. I broke down the exact financial structure of his pristine cosmetic clinic. I detailed the 4 luxury dental chairs that cost $80,000 each. I listed the advanced panoramic imaging machines, the hospital-grade sterilization units, and the customized surgical lighting systems. I explained that I did not buy those for him either. I purchased every single piece of that high-end medical machinery through a secondary holding company registered exclusively in my name. I watched his eyes widen in absolute horror as he read the equipment lease contract he had carelessly signed weeks ago. He had probably signed it without reading a single page because he arrogantly assumed his uneducated father was just handing him a blank check. I spelled it out for him with brutal clarity. I told him that my holding company was currently leasing that machinery back to his dental practice on a strict monthly basis. I explained the concept of a uniform commercial code lien. I told him that my lawyers had filed comprehensive legal claims against every single physical asset inside that clinic. I explained that he does not own a single tool required to perform his job. If I terminate the equipment lease, he is left with nothing but an empty room and a meaningless medical degree. Bradley dropped the papers onto the coffee table. His hands were shaking uncontrollably now. The illusion of his self-made empire was shattering into a million tiny pieces right in front of him. I leaned forward in my armchair, making absolutely sure he felt the full crushing weight of his situation. I summarized his actual net worth. I told him that he owns a highly curated brand name, a fancy logo printed on a piece of frosted glass, and a social media account filled with carefully filtered photos. That is the entire extent of his mighty empire. Everything else, the physical location, the mechanical infrastructure, the very tools he needs to generate a single dollar of income, belongs absolutely and entirely to me. I reminded him of his wife's cruel words from our phone call. I pointed out that Monica was technically correct when she said my blue-collar aesthetic did not fit their brand. I agreed that I did not belong in their waiting room as a guest. I told him that I belong there as the absolute owner of the ground they are standing on. I watched the profound realization sink deep into his bones. He realized that the $600,000 was not a parental gift he could take and run away with. It was an ironclad financial trap, meticulously designed to ensure that if he ever forgot the sacrifices that built his life, I could legally dismantle his entire false reality with a single phone call. He stared at me, no longer seeing a tired old construction worker in a faded flannel shirt. He was finally seeing the man who had spent 40 years negotiating brutal commercial contracts and surviving the ruthless world of physical labor. I did not give him a single inch of sympathy. I told him that his operating capital was gone. The secondary bank wire he was demanding did not exist. I explained that because his vendor bills were past due, he was officially in breach of our master lease agreement. I told him he had exactly 48 hours to cure the financial default, or I would exercise my legal right as his landlord and equipment lessor to lock the doors and seize every single asset inside that building. Bradley stared at the master lease agreement for a long time. The silence in my living room was absolute. I could see the gears turning in his head, desperately searching for a way out of the legal cage I had just locked him inside. Instead of accepting reality, his survival instinct manifested as pure, blind arrogance. He shoved the documents back across the coffee table. He let out a loud, contemptuous laugh, shaking his head as if I had just told him a pathetic joke. He stood up, smoothing the wrinkles out of his expensive scrubs. He looked down at me and declared that I was a relic of a dead era. He told me that modern corporate finance does not work like a back-alley construction deal. He proudly announced that his clinic was already generating massive buzz and that any high-end commercial bank in the city would be thrilled to offer him $1 million line of credit based on his projected revenue alone. He pointed his finger at my chest and vowed to walk into a bank first thing tomorrow morning. He promised to secure a massive commercial loan, use the cash to buy out my entire lease, and permanently crush the pathetic little leverage I thought I had over him. He leaned down his face, inches from mine, and told me that once the bank cleared his loan, he would write me a check for my $600,000, and I would never see him or his wife ever again. I did not blink. I did not flinch. I simply nodded. I told him that going to a bank sounded like a very proactive business decision. Bradley sneered, believing he had just won the negotiation. He turned on his heel, marched out my front door, and slammed it shut behind him. Seconds later, I heard the aggressive roar of his sports car tearing down my gravel driveway, speeding off to rescue his artificial empire. I sat alone in the quiet house. I reached over to the side table and picked up my heavy smartphone. I dialed the private number of Jonathan Reed. Jonathan answered on the second ring, his voice sharp and strictly professional. I did not bother with small talk. I told Jonathan that the bait had been taken. I informed him that my son was heading to a commercial bank in the morning to apply for a $1 million credit line, and that he fully intended to use the clinic machinery as collateral to secure the funds. Jonathan let out a low, knowing chuckle over the receiver. I gave him the final order. I told him to make sure the trap was perfectly primed. I instructed him to verify that our uniform commercial code liens were actively registered and visible on every single piece of medical machinery in that building. I told Jonathan that the moment Bradley attempted to leverage my property for his own debt, he would trigger the fatal clause in the master lease. I hung up the phone, perfectly content to let my son dig his own financial grave. The very next morning, Bradley and Monica walked through the heavy glass doors of the most exclusive commercial bank in the financial district. They moved with an arrogant swagger that only belongs to people who believe they are completely untouchable. They were dressed to project an absolute illusion of massive wealth. Bradley wore a custom-tailored navy blue suit that cost more than a reliable used vehicle. Monica carried a highly exclusive designer leather handbag and wore large dark sunglasses indoors, acting as if she were a local celebrity trying to avoid the paparazzi. They did not walk up to the standard teller windows like regular working-class citizens. They demanded an immediate private meeting with the senior vice president of commercial lending. They sat down in the plush leather chairs of the executive office, completely blind to the fact that they were walking directly into the steel jaws of the legal trap I had set for them. Bradley crossed his legs confidently and leaned back, playing the role of the visionary medical entrepreneur. Monica sat beside him casually, sipping a glass of imported sparkling water, provided by the bank staff, nodding along, as if she were a seasoned expert in high-level corporate finance. They spent the first 20 minutes of the meeting completely ignoring their actual financial realities. Instead, they aggressively pitched their heavily curated brand to the experienced loan officer. Bradley spoke grandly about his highly exclusive client list. He bragged about the local television personalities and the wealthy corporate executives who had attended his heavily restricted grand opening ceremony. He described the pristine marble floors, the imported Italian leather waiting chairs, and the custom artisan coffee bar they had installed in the lobby. Monica chimed in frequently, boasting about their social media metrics and the flawless luxury aesthetic of their online marketing campaign. They tried to dazzle the bank executive with industry buzzwords and empty promises of massive future revenue. They painted a vivid picture of a medical empire that was destined to completely dominate the local luxury cosmetic market. The senior loan officer listened politely, taking careful notes on a yellow legal pad. But commercial banks do not lend $1 million based on social media followers and shiny marble floors. When the executive finally asked the necessary question about tangible physical assets and corporate collateral, Bradley leaned forward with a smug and victorious smile. He truly believed this was his absolute trump card. He confidently slid a glossy printed inventory list across the polished mahogany desk. He proudly announced that his clinic was fully equipped with the absolute most advanced medical machinery currently available on the global market. He listed the items one by one, his voice dripping with unearned arrogance. He highlighted the 4 luxury dental operating chairs, explicitly stating that they were valued at exactly $80,000 each. He pointed out the state-of-the-art panoramic imaging machines, the hospital-grade sterilization units, and the customized surgical lighting systems. Bradley formally offered every single piece of that high-end equipment as direct collateral to secure a $1 million commercial line of credit. He assured the loan officer that the machinery was brand new, perfectly maintained, and easily worth enough to cover the massive cash loan they were currently demanding. Monica smiled brightly at the executive, completely convinced that their brilliant financial maneuver was about to succeed. They genuinely believed they had outsmarted a foolish old construction worker. They thought they could simply walk into a luxury bank, leverage the expensive machinery I had purchased with my own blood and sweat, and walk out with $1 million in cash to fund their lavish lifestyle. They sat in that quiet executive office, breathing the crisp air-conditioned air, already dreaming about how they would spend the bank funds. They had absolutely no idea that every single item on their glossy inventory list was already locked down tight by a legally binding commercial lien. They were confidently offering the bank a mountain of expensive machinery that they did not actually own. The executive loan officer had been gone for exactly 25 minutes. Bradley and Monica sat in the comfortable leather chairs, whispering to each other about which luxury car they might upgrade to once the $1 million credit line was deposited. Their delusion was absolute. The heavy mahogany door clicked open, and the loan officer walked back into the room. The entire atmosphere shifted the second he crossed the threshold. He was no longer smiling. The polite, accommodating demeanor of a banker eager to secure a wealthy client had completely vanished. He looked at Bradley with a mixture of cold, professional detachment and barely concealed irritation. He did not offer them more sparkling water. He walked behind his massive desk and sat down heavily, dropping a thick manila folder directly on top of Bradley's glossy printed inventory list. Bradley leaned forward, completely misreading the room. He confidently asked how quickly the bank could expedite the funds, assuming the paperwork was just a minor formality. The loan officer folded his hands over the manila folder. He looked Bradley directly in the eye and stated with absolute finality that the bank would not be extending a single dollar of credit to his clinic. He announced that the loan application was unconditionally denied. The words hung in the crisp, air-conditioned room. Monica let out a sharp, incredulous laugh, assuming the executive was making a terrible joke. Bradley's arrogant smile froze on his face. He quickly shifted from confident entrepreneur to offended VIP. He demanded to know what the problem was, raising his voice to remind the banker of the massive future revenue the clinic was projected to generate. He pointed a manicured finger at his inventory list, repeating that he was offering hundreds of thousands of dollars in brand new state-of-the-art medical machinery as premium collateral. The loan officer did not flinch. He opened the manila folder and pulled out a stack of documents with official county seals stamped on the top. He pushed them across the desk toward Bradley. He explained that his underwriting team had run a standard background asset check on the clinic and its physical property. He told Bradley that every single piece of equipment on that glossy list was currently encumbered by a massive, legally binding Uniform Commercial Code lien, commonly known as a UCC-1 filing. Bradley stared at the banker blankly, the financial terminology not fully registering in his arrogant mind. Monica took off her oversized dark sunglasses, her manufactured high society persona cracking under the sudden tension. She demanded that the banker speak plainly. The executive obliged with surgical precision. He explained that a UCC-1 is a public legal notice filed by a creditor to formally declare that they have a primary security interest in a piece of personal property. He picked up Bradley's inventory list and began cross-referencing it with the county documents. He told them that the 4 luxury dental chairs, the ones Bradley claimed were worth $80,000 each, were not owned by Bradley's medical practice. They were officially registered as the exclusive property of a private holding company called Apex Commercial Holdings. He moved down the list. The panoramic imaging machines, the hospital-grade sterilization units, the customized surgical lighting systems. The banker systematically destroyed their entire portfolio piece by piece. He informed them that the underwriting team had verified the master lease agreement. He looked at Bradley with absolute disgust and stated that Bradley was merely a renter. The loan officer made it brutally clear. He explained that a commercial bank cannot accept leased property as collateral because the applicant has absolutely zero legal equity in those assets. If Bradley defaulted on a bank loan, the bank would have no legal right to seize the dental chairs because Apex Commercial Holdings already owned them free and clear. The banker leaned across his desk, his voice dropping to a low warning tone. He informed Bradley that attempting to secure a $1 million financial loan using another corporation's property as collateral was not just poor business practice. It bordered on gross misrepresentation and federal bank fraud. I wish I could have been in the room to witness the exact moment my trap snapped shut around his throat. According to Jonathan Reed's later conversations with the bank's legal team, the physical reaction was devastating. The arrogant red flush completely drained from Bradley's face, leaving his skin a sickly pale white. His jaw practically unhinged as he stared at the official county filings. The reality of my warning from the previous night finally crushed him. I had told him he owned nothing but a logo, and now the most powerful commercial bank in the city was telling him the exact same thing. Monica started to hyperventilate. Her breathing became shallow and erratic. She looked frantically at her husband, demanding that he fix the situation, demanding that he explain why the bank thought they were just pathetic renters. Bradley could not speak. His mouth opened and closed, but no words came out. The illusion of his self-made empire was fully exposed as a complete and utter fraud. He realized that the bank executive did not see a visionary medical professional sitting across the desk. The executive saw a desperate, over-leveraged imposter trying to pawn off his landlord's machinery to fund a fake luxury lifestyle. The loan officer did not give them time to recover from the shock. He stood up from his leather chair, signaling that the meeting was permanently over. He gathered the official documents, placed them back into the manila folder, and slid Bradley's useless inventory list back across the desk. He advised Bradley to hire a competent corporate attorney, immediately noting that his current financial structure was a massive liability. He then formally asked them to leave his office. Bradley slowly stood up, his legs visibly trembling beneath his expensive tailored suit. He reached out with shaking hands to pick up his glossy inventory list, the paper now representing nothing but his own monumental arrogance and failure. Monica grabbed her designer handbag, her face flushed with absolute humiliation. They did not say another word. They turned and walked out of the executive office, their wealthy facades completely shattered. They marched through the pristine bank lobby, no longer the untouchable elite, but 2 terrified frauds who had just realized they were entirely at my mercy. They walked out into the harsh sunlight of the financial district completely empty-handed, knowing that the 48-hour countdown to their total ruin was already ticking rapidly away. I sat in the heavy leather guest chair across from Jonathan Reed in his downtown corporate law office, The room was perfectly quiet, insulated from the loud city traffic below by thick, reinforced glass. Jonathan looked at his computer monitor and gave a slow and calculated nod. He informed me that his primary contacts at the commercial bank had just confirmed our absolute worst suspicions. Bradley and Monica had explicitly listed the dental operating chairs and the panoramic imaging machines on their official financial loan application. I did not feel a single ounce of surprise. I did not feel any parental disappointment. I only felt the cold and absolute certainty of a man watching a mathematically predicted storm finally make its devastating landfall. Jonathan folded his hands on top of his massive mahogany desk. He leaned forward and explained the severe legal gravity of what my son had just executed. He told me that by formally offering my medical machinery as direct collateral to a federally insured commercial bank, Bradley had not simply made a foolish amateur business mistake. He had committed a catastrophic and fatal breach of our contract. Jonathan reached over and opened the heavy black leather binder containing the original master equipment lease. He flipped the thick parchment pages until he reached Section 4. He read the exact legal phrasing aloud to me. The binding contract explicitly stated that any attempt by the lessee to encumber, pledge, or leverage the leased physical assets for third-party debt constituted an immediate, irreversible, and incurable material default. Bradley had unknowingly handed us the absolute legal right to dismantle his entire clinic piece by piece. He did not just fail to pay his high-end contractors on time. He had actively attempted to defraud a major financial institution using my exclusive corporate property. I looked at Jonathan and gave him a simple nod. I told him to begin drafting the legal paperwork immediately. I made it explicitly clear that I did not want a polite warning letter. I did not want a temporary suspension of operations. I wanted a total and ruthless execution of our maximum legal rights. Jonathan turned to his keyboard. The sharp mechanical sound of his typing echoed in the quiet office like heavy nails being driven into solid wood. He was meticulously drafting a formal notice of default and repossession. He read the harsh terms aloud to me as he constructed the devastating document. The legal notice declared that due to the unauthorized fraudulent pledge of leased corporate assets, the master lease agreement was instantly and permanently terminated. The notice gave Bradley exactly 48 hours to completely vacate the commercial premises and physically surrender all mechanical property back to Apex Commercial Holdings. It was a completely impossible demand designed to break him. He could not run a luxury cosmetic dental clinic without operating chairs or surgical lights. He could not physically move the heavy equipment because the complex machines were deeply bolted to the concrete floors and legally secured by our aggressive public liens. I sat in the quiet office listening to the clinical, unfeeling, and devastating legal language. Every single complex sentence Jonathan typed systematically stripped away another layer of my son's artificial empire. There was absolutely no room for future negotiation. There was no legal avenue for a temporary extension or a desperate financial settlement. It was an absolute financial chokehold constructed entirely out of his own arrogant mistakes. Jonathan finished typing and sent the document to his private machine. The large printer hummed softly in the corner, smoothly delivering the physical instrument of Bradley's complete professional ruin. Jonathan gathered the warm pages, squared the edges, and laid the heavy document directly in front of me. I picked up a thick black pen and signed my name on the bottom line. My hand did not shake. My signature was steady, bold, and firm. I was not signing away my son's future. I was simply holding a deeply arrogant man accountable to the exact, strict rules he thought he was too important to follow. Jonathan did not place the crucial notice in the regular postal mail. He did not send an electronic message that could be conveniently ignored, deleted, or filtered into a hidden junk folder. He picked up his desk phone and directly called an aggressive private process server. He ordered the server to deliver the sealed document directly to the luxury dental clinic within the hour. He gave highly specific instructions that the legal envelope must be handed directly to Bradley in the middle of his busy operating hours, right in front of his wealthy patients. I wanted the delivery to be a physical, highly visible, and completely undeniable public event. I walked out of Jonathan's office and into the crowded city streets knowing the final countdown to his destruction had officially begun. It was just past midnight when the absolute reality of their financial destruction finally infiltrated Monica's carefully curated world. Bradley had locked himself in their master bedroom, drowning his monumental failure in a bottle of expensive scotch. But Monica did not sleep. She sat alone in the dark on her imported Italian leather sofa, staring at the glowing screen of her luxury smartphone. Her mind was not focused on her husband's ruined medical career or the legal devastation waiting for them at dawn. She was calculating the immediate collapse of her social empire. The monthly dues for her elite country club membership were automatically drafted in exactly 3 days. The lease payment for her high-end luxury SUV was already a week overdue. She knew that the second her wealthy friends realized she was broke, she would be completely exiled from the high society circles she had ruthlessly clawed her way into. She was a woman who defined her entire existence by her perceived superiority over others, and the thought of becoming a public cautionary tale terrified her more than any legal document ever could. She did not accept defeat. Instead, her extreme entitlement metastasized into pure and desperate criminality. If she could not legally leverage the clinic's assets through a commercial bank, she would liquidate them illegally in the shadows. She opened her encrypted messaging application and began frantically searching through her extensive contact list. During the lengthy construction phase of the clinic, Monica had personally overseen the interior design and logistics. She had interacted with dozens of secondary suppliers, shady liquidators, and wholesale brokers who dealt heavily in the gray market of medical equipment. She found the specific number she was looking for. It belonged to a ruthless, unlicensed medical liquidator who specialized in moving expensive surgical machinery across state lines with absolutely no questions asked. She dialed the number, her hands shaking violently as the phone rang in the dead of night. When the gruff voice answered, Monica completely dropped her refined socialite persona. She spoke in quick, hushed tones, glancing nervously toward the closed bedroom door. She told the liquidator she had immediate, unhindered access to 3 brand-new state-of-the-art cosmetic dental operating chairs. She explicitly stated that they retailed for $80,000 each, but she was willing to sell all 3 of them for a tiny fraction of their actual value if he could bring a heavy transport truck and $30,000 in untraceable cash to the clinic by tomorrow morning. The liquidator hesitated, smelling the obvious desperation in her voice. He demanded to know if the equipment was legally clear of any corporate liens or bank holds. Monica lied without a single ounce of hesitation. She swore the machinery was owned completely free and clear by her husband's private medical practice. She promised the liquidator that she held the master physical keys and the primary security codes and that they could move the heavy equipment out the back loading dock before the clinic officially opened its doors for the day. She aggressively negotiated the drop-off, telling him that she needed the cash in a briefcase the moment the chairs were loaded onto his truck. The liquidator agreed to the illicit deal, sensing a massive and incredibly easy profit. He promised to have a heavy transport crew waiting at the rear service entrance of the clinic at exactly 10 o'clock the next morning. Monica hung up the phone, letting out a long, shuddering breath. She actually smiled in the dark, genuinely believing she had just executed a brilliant and stealthy financial maneuver to save her luxury lifestyle. She thought she was being incredibly clever, completely bypassing the massive legal roadblocks I had systematically set in her path. She planned to take the $30,000 in cash, pay her country club dues, hide the rest in a private account, and let Bradley deal with the fallout of the missing equipment. But arrogance always creates severe and fatal blind spots. When I purchased the commercial building through my blind corporate trust, I did not just install standard commercial locks on the exterior doors. I had personally upgraded the entire property with a state-of-the-art high-definition security network. The interior cameras and the digital access logs were directly linked to my private server at my house. She thought she was operating in total secrecy. She had absolutely no idea that I was already sitting quietly in my home office watching her digital access codes being verified on the clinic's alarm system. I knew exactly what she was planning the moment she logged into the clinic's security portal to disable the rear loading dock sensors. I did not call the police to stop her. I simply poured myself a cup of black coffee and waited perfectly content to let her walk directly into a federal felony. I sat in the quiet corner of Jonathan Reed's office holding a warm cup of black coffee. It was barely 9:00 o'clock in the morning. Jonathan had his large computer monitor angled directly toward me. The screen displayed a crystal-clear live security feed from the rear loading dock of the dental clinic. The high-definition cameras I had quietly installed months ago were capturing every single desperate move my daughter-in-law was making. Monica was pacing nervously near the heavy steel doors wearing an expensive designer coat over her workout clothes. She kept checking her luxury watch and peering down the concrete alleyway. A few minutes later, a battered, unmarked transport truck backed up to the loading bay. 3 large men jumped out of the cab. Monica rushed forward, pointing frantically toward the interior hallway leading to the main operating rooms. She was actually doing it. She was actively attempting to steal $240,000 worth of leased medical machinery just to pay for her country club dues. Jonathan leaned back in his leather chair and shook his head in absolute disbelief. He pointed to the screen as the men tried to push the heavy steel doors open. They could not get inside. Monica was frantically punching her management code into the exterior digital keypad. She did not realize that I had permanently revoked her digital access privileges the moment I signed the repossession notice yesterday afternoon. On the silent video feed, we watched her face twist into a mask of sheer panic. She pounded her fists against the reinforced security glass. The men from the transport truck stood around looking incredibly annoyed. One of them checked his watch and shook his head, indicating they were not going to wait around for a locked door. Monica grabbed the massive man by the arm, begging him to stay and promising she would find another way inside. She was completely trapped by her own massive arrogance. Jonathan picked up his desk phone. He asked me if I wanted him to dispatch the local police to the alleyway right now to arrest her for attempted grand larceny. I took a slow sip of my coffee and told him to put the phone down immediately. I explained that having her arrested in a quiet alley before the clinic even opened would be entirely too merciful. I did not want her to suffer in the shadows, where she could easily spin a web of lies to protect her reputation. She had humiliated me and dismissed my entire existence because she wanted to curate a flawless public brand. I told Jonathan that true accountability requires a massive audience. We were going to let the clinic open for the day. We were going to wait until 10 o'clock, when the pristine marble lobby was absolutely packed with Bradley's wealthiest patients and Monica's elite socialite friends. I wanted her to feel the crushing weight of her failure right in front of the exact people she was willing to commit a federal felony to impress. Jonathan slowly lowered the phone back onto its receiver. A cold, precise smile crept across his face. He understood exactly the kind of devastation I was constructing. He closed the security feed on his monitor and stood up from his desk. He adjusted his tailored suit tie and picked up the thick leather binder containing the formal repossession orders. I set my coffee cup down and stood up next to him. I looked down at my scuffed brown construction boots. They were the exact same boots Monica had claimed were too ugly to be seen by her exclusive guests. I told Jonathan it was time to go introduce them to the real owner of the building. We walked out of the law office together, heading straight for the heart of their fragile, artificial empire. The clock on my dashboard read exactly 10:15 in the morning when I pulled my rusted 1998 pickup truck into the immaculate private parking lot of the clinic. The lot was completely full of imported European luxury sedans and high-performance sports cars. I did not park in the back near the dumpsters where the delivery drivers were instructed to go. I parked my massive dented steel truck directly in the front row, right across 2 spaces clearly marked for VIP cosmetic patients. I turned off the ignition, and the old engine sputtered and coughed before finally dying. Jonathan Reed pulled his sleek black town car into the fire lane directly behind me. We stepped out into the bright morning sun. Waiting for us on the sidewalk was a crew of 6 massive men wearing heavy gray industrial canvas work uniforms. They were not carrying clipboards or polite legal notices. They were pulling heavy steel pallet jacks, rolling thick moving dollies, and carrying heavy-duty power drills. This was not a negotiation. This was a physical extraction. I gave the foreman a single nod and walked toward the towering frosted glass doors of the main entrance. I reached out and pulled the heavy glass door open. The atmosphere inside the clinic was heavily curated to feel like a 5-star luxury spa. A soft classical piano melody played from hidden surround sound speakers. The air smelled of expensive lavender oil and freshly ground artisan coffee. 6 wealthy patients were sitting on the imported white leather sofas, casually browsing through high-fashion magazines or tapping on their expensive smartphones. They were completely immersed in their bubble of absolute privilege. I stepped onto the pristine imported white marble floor. I was wearing the exact same faded denim jeans, heavy flannel work shirt, and scuffed brown steel-toed boots that I had worn to pour the concrete foundation of this very building. My boots were caked with dried mud and old cement dust. Every single step I took made a loud, aggressive, echoing thud against the marble. It was the sound of harsh reality violently intruding upon their delicate, artificial world. The young woman sitting behind the massive curved mahogany reception desk looked up from her computer monitor. She was dressed in a sleek black designer outfit, with her hair pulled back into a tight, perfect bun. Her eyes widened in absolute shock and immediate disgust when she saw me walking toward her. She clearly had been trained by Monica to immediately eject anyone who did not look like they belonged in a high-society country club. She stood up quickly, holding her hand out with her palm facing me. She used a sharp, condescending tone and told me that I was in the wrong building. She said the service entrance was around the back and that deliveries were not allowed in the main guest lobby. She actually reached for her desk phone, threatening to call security if I did not turn around and leave immediately. I did not stop walking. I did not even look at her. I walked right past the mahogany desk and stood in the absolute center of the main lobby. The wealthy patients on the white leather sofas had lowered their magazines. They were staring at me with a mixture of confusion and intense irritation. They were whispering to each other, clearly offended that a dirty construction worker had breached their exclusive sanctuary. Then the heavy glass doors opened again. The soft classical piano music was instantly drowned out by the harsh, aggressive sound of heavy steel wheels rolling across the marble. The 6 massive men from the repossession crew marched into the lobby, pushing their heavy metal pallet jacks and dropping thick canvas moving blankets onto the floor. The foreman unclipped a heavy steel crowbar from his belt and set it down loudly on the expensive artisan coffee bar. The absolute chaos of the moment was instantaneous. Several patients gasped and stood up from the leather sofas, clutching their designer handbags. The receptionist screamed and grabbed her phone, frantically dialing the interior offices. The serene luxury spa atmosphere was completely annihilated in a matter of seconds. The repo men did not wait for permission. They immediately began executing their orders. 2 men walked straight over to the expensive custom-built digital display monitors mounted on the lobby walls. They pulled out their heavy-duty power drills and began unscrewing the mounting brackets right over the heads of the terrified patients. The loud mechanical screech of the drills echoed through the entire clinic. Another man began rolling a heavy steel dolly down the main hallway toward the primary surgical suites. He bumped the dolly against the pristine white walls, leaving long, dark, black scuff marks on the perfect paint. The interior double doors at the end of the hallway suddenly flew open. Monica burst into the lobby. She was holding a clipboard and yelling at the top of her lungs. She demanded to know who was making all the terrible noise while her elite VIP guests were trying to relax. She marched down the hallway with furious entitlement, ready to verbally destroy whoever had dared to disrupt her perfect morning. She stepped into the lobby and stopped completely dead in her tracks. The clipboard slipped from her fingers and crashed onto the marble floor. Her mouth fell open in absolute, unadulterated horror. She looked at the massive men dismantling her expensive waiting room. Then she looked at the center of the room and saw me standing there in my dirty work boots, with my hands casually shoved into the pockets of my jeans. The blood completely drained from her face. She took a step backward, her knees visibly buckling under the sudden crushing realization that her midnight phone call to the black market liquidator had been a pathetic waste of time. A few seconds later, Bradley rushed out from one of the surgical suites. He was wearing his pristine, custom-tailored white medical coat, with his name embroidered in expensive silver thread on the chest. He was holding a delicate dental mirror in his hand. He looked completely bewildered. When he saw the repo crew and realized what was happening, his entire posture collapsed. He ran toward me, waving his hands frantically in a desperate attempt to contain the massive explosion. He stopped 2 feet away from me and hissed in a frantic, panicked whisper. He begged me to step outside into the alleyway. He promised he would sign whatever paper I wanted if I just took the men outside and stopped embarrassing him in front of his most important clients. He pleaded with me to lower my voice and protect his brand just for a few more hours until he could figure something out. I did not whisper. I did not lower my voice. I spoke loudly and clearly, ensuring that every single wealthy patient in that lobby heard every single word I said. I told my son that his brand was officially bankrupt. I told him that the 48-hour legal notice of default had been completely ignored and that his time was completely up. I announced to the entire room that he did not own a single piece of medical machinery in the building and that his entire luxury clinic was nothing but an over-leveraged house of cards. The patients in the lobby began whispering frantically to each other. One prominent local television executive immediately stood up, grabbed her coat, and declared that she would not be operated on in a bankrupt facility. She marched out the front doors without looking back. 2 other patients immediately followed her, rushing out of the clinic to escape the sheer humiliation of the scene. Jonathan Reed stepped forward from the entrance. He did not whisper either. He held up the thick legal repossession order with the county seals clearly visible. He used his booming courtroom voice to announce to the remaining staff that Apex Commercial Holdings was immediately executing a full physical seizure of all leased property due to gross financial default and suspected federal fraud. He pointed directly at Bradley and ordered him to step away from the surgical suites immediately. He told the repossession crew to move into the back rooms and begin unbolting the $80,000 dental chairs from the concrete floors. Monica suddenly snapped out of her frozen state of shock. She lunged forward and grabbed the arm of the nearest repo man, screaming that he was trespassing and that she would have him thrown in prison. The massive man barely even registered her presence. He simply pulled his arm away and continued pushing his pallet jack toward the surgical rooms. Monica turned to Jonathan Reed and shrieked that she was a personal guarantor on the building and that she had legal rights to stop the seizure. She yelled that she had signed the lease papers herself and demanded to see a judge. The loud, chaotic noise in the lobby seemed to completely stop for a fraction of a second. Jonathan Reed froze. He slowly lowered the repossession documents and turned his head to look directly at me. I looked back at him, my expression hardening into solid stone. We both knew the absolute truth. I had drafted the master lease agreement entirely on my own. I had explicitly and deliberately excluded Monica from every single line of the corporate paperwork because I never trusted her. I never allowed her to sign as a guarantor. She had just publicly confessed to signing legal documents that she was never authorized to touch. Bradley dropped his dental mirror onto the marble floor. It shattered into pieces. He covered his face with his hands and let out a pathetic, whimpering sound. Monica was leaning heavily against the reception desk, sobbing uncontrollably, as her elite socialite friends watched her entire fake world collapse into absolute humiliating ruin. I stood in the center of the room, watching the heavy steel dollies roll past me entirely unmoved by their tears. I had built the foundation of their lives with my bare hands, and now I was watching my legal team rip it straight down to the studs. Jonathan Reed did not retreat when Monica screamed at him. He stepped directly into the center of the devastated waiting room. He held the thick leather binder high enough for everyone in the room to see the official county seals pressed into the heavy paper. He possessed the commanding theatrical presence of a man who had destroyed massive corporate empires for a living. He turned his back entirely on my son and faced the remaining wealthy patients and the elite socialite friends Monica had invited for a private morning consultation. He spoke with a loud, booming voice that echoed off the high marble walls, completely silencing the frantic sobbing of my daughter-in-law. He announced that he was the senior legal counsel for Apex Commercial Holdings and that he was executing an immediate and total physical asset forfeiture. He did not use confusing legal jargon to hide the truth. He weaponized the terminology by translating it into brutal absolute facts for the wealthy audience. He pointed a long, sharp finger at the $80,000 dental chairs currently being unbolted from the concrete floors by the repossession crew. He declared loudly that the clinic was operating under a fraudulent pretense. He informed the room that Bradley and Monica did not own the chairs they were sitting on, the expensive lighting fixtures hanging above their heads or the very floor beneath their feet. He told the elite guests that the clinic was currently in massive financial default for failing to pay basic operational leases and that the owners were completely bankrupt. He let the word bankrupt hang in the air like a physical weight. Monica tried to interrupt him. She stepped in front of her country club friends, waving her hands and frantically lying that it was just a minor banking error. She forced a pathetic plastic smile and told her wealthy peers that her husband was simply restructuring their massive portfolio. Jonathan did not even look at her. He simply raised his voice over her pathetic excuses and delivered the fatal blow. He informed the elite audience that just 24 hours ago, the clinic management had attempted to commit federal bank fraud by pledging stolen leased machinery as collateral to secure a desperately needed line of credit. The wealthy socialites gasped. The word fraud was the absolute kiss of death in their highly insulated circles. I watched the exact moment Monica's carefully curated social empire evaporated into nothing. The wealthy women sitting on the imported leather sofas did not offer her any sympathy. They looked at her with pure, unadulterated disgust. In their world, financial failure was considered an unfortunate misstep, but attempting to fake massive wealth using stolen rental property was an unforgivable social sin. One of the women, a prominent local real estate developer who Monica had spent months desperately trying to impress, stood up and carefully smoothed her expensive cashmere coat. She looked Monica dead in the eye and coldly stated that she would be calling her personal accountant immediately to cancel her premium membership retainer. She told Monica never to contact her again. She turned around and walked out the heavy glass doors without another word. The remaining elite guests quickly followed suit. They gathered their designer bags and scrambled to get out of the clinic as fast as possible, desperate to escape, before the stench of poverty and federal crime could permanently attach itself to their own pristine reputations. Jonathan Reed continued reciting the exact legal terms of the default order while the massive crew worked with terrifying efficiency. The loud grinding sound of heavy metal ratchets and industrial power drills served as the perfect background music to his devastating legal monologue. He instructed the foreman to move to the lobby and dismantle the custom artisan coffee bar that Monica had bragged so much about. The repo men grabbed their heavy crowbars and began prying the expensive espresso machines directly off the marble countertops. He publicly ordered the crew to strip the entire clinic down to the bare drywall, leaving absolutely nothing of value behind. Bradley stood completely frozen in the main hallway, watching his elite clientele abandon him in droves. His pristine white medical coat suddenly looked like a cheap, pathetic costume. He was a fraudulent king without a kingdom, entirely stripped of his unearned arrogance and left with absolutely nothing. Monica had collapsed onto the reception desk, burying her face in her arms, as the heavy steel dollies rolled the expensive machinery right past her, out the front doors. The fake luxury illusion was completely shattered, leaving nothing but the cold, hard, undeniable reality of their absolute ruin. Monica watched the heavy glass doors swing shut behind the last of her wealthy friends. The absolute silence they left behind was completely deafening, broken only by the loud mechanical grinding of the repossession crew ripping her artisan coffee bar apart. The shock that had paralyzed her just moments ago instantly mutated into a blinding, irrational rage. She could not accept that her carefully constructed social empire had just been annihilated by a man she considered entirely beneath her. She turned away from the reception desk and marched directly toward me, her designer heels clicking aggressively against the scuffed marble floor. Her face was twisted into a mask of pure, unadulterated hatred. She pointed a trembling, manicured finger inches from my face and began to scream. She did not sound like a refined socialite anymore. She sounded like a cornered, desperate animal. She shrieked that she was going to hire the most vicious litigation firm in the country to destroy me. She threatened to sue me for severe emotional distress, for public defamation, and for the total destruction of her pristine business reputation. She yelled that I had absolutely no right to publicly humiliate her in front of her elite peers, completely ignoring the fact that she had deliberately excluded me from my own son's milestone celebration just weeks prior. Bradley tried to step forward, to calm her down, begging her to stop shouting in the middle of the ruined lobby, but she violently shoved his hand away. She was completely lost in her own delusion of untouchable entitlement. She turned her venom toward Jonathan Reed, who was standing quietly next to me, holding the heavy leather binder. She screamed that his repossession orders were entirely illegal. She demanded that he order the heavy crew to stop dismantling her clinic immediately. Then, in her blind and frantic attempt to reclaim any shred of power, Monica made the most catastrophic mistake of her entire life. She puffed out her chest and yelled that she was not just a helpless bystander. She screamed that she was a primary financial guarantor on the commercial property. She stated loudly and clearly that she had personally reviewed and physically signed every single page of the master lease guarantees, and therefore she had absolute legal authority to halt the physical asset seizure. The loud grinding sound of the power drills seemed to fade entirely into the background. Jonathan Reed stopped moving. He slowly lowered the leather binder. I slowly turned my head and looked directly at him. He looked back at me, his eyes narrowing, as the massive legal implications of her chaotic words settled heavily into the room. The metaphorical music had completely stopped. We both knew the absolute, undeniable truth. When I drafted those commercial contracts months ago, I had insisted on maintaining total operational control. I explicitly instructed Jonathan to leave Monica's name completely off every single legal document. I never trusted her, and I never allowed her to sign as a financial guarantor for my property. If she believed she had signed those guarantees, and if her signature was somehow on the secondary banking copies they had submitted to the commercial lenders, it meant only one terrifying thing. She had not just lied to a bank officer. She had actively forged signatures and fraudulently altered highly sensitive corporate documents to secure her luxury lifestyle. I looked back at Monica. She was still breathing heavily, a triumphant and arrogant sneer returning to her face, genuinely believing she had just played a brilliant legal trump card. She had absolutely no idea that in her desperate attempt to prove her own importance, she had just publicly confessed to a massive federal crime. The repossession of her clinic was no longer just a civil business dispute. The trap had permanently locked, and we were about to hand her directly over to the federal authorities. We left the ruined clinic behind us without looking back. The drive back to this corporate law office was completed in absolute silence. I did not feel a single ounce of pity for the tears my daughter-in-law had shed on the marble floor. I only felt the cold, precise focus of a man who had just been handed the final puzzle piece to complete a total demolition. Monica had publicly screamed that she signed the lease guarantees. I knew for an absolute fact that she was never authorized to touch my corporate property documents. If her name was on any official bank filing alongside mine, It meant we were no longer dealing with a simple civil eviction. We were dealing with a massive financial crime. Jonathan and I walked into his private, secure conference room. The heavy oak doors clicked shut, sealing us inside. The large mahogany table in the center of the room was entirely empty except for a thick stack of secondary financial documents Jonathan had subpoenaed from the commercial lenders during his initial background checks. These were the exact files Bradley and Monica had submitted to the bank to prove their supposed net worth. We sat down across from each other. Jonathan loosened his expensive silk tie and opened the first manila folder. We did not speak. We simply began the clinical and methodical process of a forensic financial audit. We spent the first hour cross-referencing every single page of their submitted loan application. We traced the fraudulent claims they had made about my medical equipment. Then Jonathan opened a separate file labeled Personal Liabilities. He spread the papers across the smooth wood of the conference table. He was looking for the exact guarantee document Monica had arrogantly bragged about in the lobby. The room was perfectly silent, except for the crisp sound of heavy paper turning. Then Jonathan's hands suddenly stopped moving. He did not gasp or act surprised. He simply let out a long, slow breath and slid a multi-page bank contract across the table toward me. He tapped his index finger next to the bottom signature line. I looked down at the paper. It was not a commercial lease guarantee. It was a private high-interest personal loan application from a secondary financial institution. The total principal amount printed boldly at the top of the page was exactly $150,000. I read the itemized description of the loan. It was not used for clinic payroll or to pay the high-end contractors they were dodging. The funds were explicitly earmarked for the purchase of a brand new, fully loaded luxury Porsche Cayenne. It was the exact same matte black vehicle Monica had been driving around the city for the past month, parading her fake wealth at the elite country club. She had taken out a massive side loan just to curate her socialite image while the medical suppliers were threatening to shut down her husband's business. But the luxury vehicle was not the fatal discovery. I moved my eyes down to the bottom of the final page where the financial guarantors were required to sign. Bradley's signature was there, written in his typical careless scrawl. Right next to it was Monica's elegant, sweeping handwriting, and directly below their names on the line designated for the primary financial backer was my name. I stared at the signature. It was a pathetic and desperate attempt at forgery. The loops of the letters were entirely too rounded. The heavy pressure of the pen strokes did not match the sharp, decisive angles of my actual handwriting. She had clearly copied it from an old birthday card or a discarded piece of mail. She needed a massive line of credit to buy her luxury car, and she knew her husband's over-leveraged clinic could not secure the funds. So she had deliberately and maliciously forged my signature using my pristine credit history and my hard-earned assets to guarantee her designer lifestyle. I looked up from the forged document and met Jonathan's eyes. We did not need to debate the legal reality of what we were looking at. Monica had not just made a foolish mistake in a desperate moment. She had walked into a federally insured bank, sat down in front of a loan officer, and submitted a fabricated legal document to steal $150,000. She had committed a severe federal felony. The repossession of the clinic was just the beginning of their punishment. The audit had just handed me the exact weapon I needed to strip away their freedom entirely. I sat in the secure conference room looking at the forged signature on the bank document. The room was incredibly quiet. Jonathan Reed leaned back in his leather chair and watched me carefully. He had represented me for over 15 years. He knew that I was a strict and demanding businessman, but he also knew that I always preferred to settle civil disputes quietly and efficiently. He asked me in a low voice if I wanted to leverage the forgery to simply force my daughter-in-law to walk away from the marriage. He suggested that we could use the threat of federal prison to make her sign an ironclad divorce agreement and leave my son alone. It was a logical and clean legal strategy, but Jonathan did not understand the deep and permanent scar that the forged document had just ripped completely open. I did not touch the paper. I kept my hands folded tightly on the edge of the mahogany table. I looked at my lawyer and told him that there would be absolutely no quiet settlements and no backroom negotiations. I told him that I was going to hand her directly over to the federal authorities and watch them lock her in a cage. Jonathan raised an eyebrow, clearly surprised by the sheer coldness of my decision. I decided to explain the absolute reality of my boundaries. I asked Jonathan if he knew how my wife had passed away. He nodded respectfully and said he knew she had suffered a fatal heart attack 20 years ago. I told him that the medical certificate listed cardiac arrest as the official cause of death, but the medical certificate was missing the actual truth. I took a slow breath and transported myself back to the hardest year of my entire life. I explained that when my wife and I were in our early 40s, we had finally managed to build a highly successful commercial contracting company. We had poured every single ounce of our blood and sweat into that business. We trusted our primary financial partner completely. We treated him like a brother. But that partner was secretly drowning in massive underground gambling debts. To save his own life, he did exactly what Monica had just done. He forged our signatures on massive corporate supply loans and completely drained our operating accounts. He stole hundreds of thousands of dollars using our names as his personal shield. I told Jonathan about the absolute horror of waking up one morning to find out that the bank had frozen all of our assets. We were completely blindsided. The crushing weight of the sudden massive debt fell squarely onto my wife's shoulders. She was the one who managed our books. She was the one who had to answer the frantic calls from our furious vendors. I described the physical toll the betrayal took on her. Over the course of 3 brutal months, I watched the love of my life slowly waste away from pure, unrelenting stress. She could not sleep. She could not eat. She lived in a constant state of suffocating panic, terrified that we were going to lose the modest home we had raised our son in. And then came the terrible night in November. The bank had issued a final foreclosure warning. She stood in our small kitchen holding the legal notice, her hands shaking violently. She looked at me with tears streaming down her face, and then she simply collapsed onto the linoleum floor. The doctors told me later that her heart simply gave out under the immense unnatural pressure of the financial terror our partner had forced upon us. I looked back at Jonathan. The conference room felt completely frozen in time. I told him that I spent the next 10 years working brutal physical labor just to dig myself out of that massive hole and clear my family name. I raised my son completely alone. I told Jonathan that financial fraud is not just a white-collar crime. It is a violent and deeply destructive act that literally stops human hearts. I pointed my calloused finger at the forged signature sitting on the table. I told Jonathan that Monica had just invited the exact same deadly poison into my family. She had used my name to fund her arrogance without a single thought about the destruction it could cause. I told my lawyer to prepare the criminal referral immediately. I was going to ensure she faced every single brutal consequence of her actions without a single drop of mercy. I drove my old rusted truck straight from Jonathan Reed's office to Bradley's luxury suburban house. The massive circular driveway was entirely empty because the repossession men had already arrived earlier in the day and towed the forged luxury vehicle right off the pristine pavement. I walked up to the heavy mahogany front door and let myself in using the emergency key I had kept on my ring for years. The massive house was completely silent. The highly curated illusion of their perfect marriage had already started to rot from the inside out. I walked down the long hallway and found them sitting in their massive open-concept kitchen. The beautiful white marble countertops were covered in empty wine glasses and crumpled legal papers from the ruined clinic. Bradley was holding his head in his hands, looking absolutely pathetic. Monica was pacing near the massive bay windows, chewing nervously on her thumbnail. They both froze completely when I walked into the room with Jonathan right behind me. Bradley stood up quickly, expecting me to offer some kind of parental bailout, He actually took a step toward me, holding his hands out as if he was waiting for a sympathetic embrace. I did not embrace him. I walked directly to the massive marble kitchen island and dropped the thick manila folder onto the cold stone surface. I told him to open it. Bradley hesitated, looking past me at Jonathan, who was standing by the doorway like a grim executioner. Bradley slowly reached out and flipped the heavy cover open. He stared at the loan application for the luxury vehicle. He looked confused at first. He told me he already knew about the car loan and that Monica handled all their personal vehicle financing, so there was no need to bring it up. I did not raise my voice. I simply told him to look at the bottom of the third page. I watched his eyes scan the dense legal text and land squarely on the guarantor signatures. I watched the exact second his brain processed the monumental severity of the forged handwriting. I told my son that his wife had walked into a federally insured commercial bank and submitted a completely fabricated legal document. I explained that she had stolen my identity and used my pristine financial history to illegally borrow $150,000 to fund her pathetic socialite lifestyle. I made it absolutely clear that this was not a civil dispute over dental chairs anymore. This was a severe federal felony carrying a mandatory prison sentence. Monica stopped pacing by the window. She rushed over to the kitchen island and looked down at the document. Her face turned the color of wet ash. She tried to stammer out a pathetic excuse, claiming it was just a temporary bridge loan and that she fully intended to pay it back before I ever found out. She actually tried to use her breathy socialite voice to smooth over a massive federal crime. I ignored her completely. I kept my eyes locked directly on my son. I delivered my final ultimatum with absolute surgical precision. I told Bradley that Jonathan had already drafted the formal criminal referral. We were sending the entire file to the federal authorities first thing in the morning. I told my son he had exactly one choice to make. He could immediately file for divorce, kick the criminal out of his house, and agree to testify against her in federal court as a completely blind and innocent spouse. If he did that, I promised to let him walk away with whatever pathetic remnants of his life he could salvage. But if he tried to defend her, if he tried to cover up her tracks, or protect her in any way, and I would instruct Jonathan to name him as a full co-conspirator in the fraud. I told him he would lose his medical license, his house, and his absolute freedom. I gave him the choice between his fraudulent marriage and his own survival. The sheer viciousness of Bradley's reaction was staggering even to me. He did not hesitate for a single second. He did not look at his wife with love or conflicted loyalty. He looked at her with pure, unadulterated hatred. He turned on her so incredibly fast, it was like watching a starving animal turn on its own pack. He grabbed the forged document and shoved it right into her face. He started screaming at the top of his lungs. He demanded to know how she could be so incredibly stupid. He yelled that she had single-handedly destroyed his entire life, his pristine reputation, and his medical career just so she could drive a fancy car to her ridiculous country club. He did not offer to help her. He completely threw her to the wolves to save his own skin. He pointed his finger toward the heavy front door and ordered her to get out of his house immediately. He screamed that he was calling a divorce attorney right that second and that he would happily testify to the federal authorities that she was a manipulative, pathological liar. He told her she was a parasite who had dragged his absolute brilliance down into the mud. Monica stared at him in absolute shock. The man she had spent years manipulating, the man whose ego she had constantly inflated, was now violently discarding her to save himself. The shock rapidly dissolved into a blind, venomous rage. If Bradley was going to throw her into the fire, she was absolutely determined to drag him down into the flames right alongside her. She slapped the forged document out of his hand and stepped right into his personal space. She did not whisper. She screamed right back at him, her voice cracking with pure venom. She asked him who he thought he was calling a parasite. She reminded him that she spent the last 3 years managing every single detail of his pathetic life, because he was too obsessed with his own reflection to actually run a business. She yelled that she bought the luxury car to keep up appearances for his high-end clinic. She claimed that she committed the fraud specifically for him because his fragile ego demanded that they project a lifestyle of absolute wealth. The argument devolved into the most vicious, ugly display of human nature I have ever witnessed. They stood in their massive luxury kitchen, tearing each other apart piece by piece. Monica laughed hysterically and completely shattered his professional ego. She told him he was a mediocre dentist who only had a clinic because his daddy bought it for him. She screamed that none of the wealthy patients actually respected him. She told him that the country club executives laughed at him behind his back because they all knew he was just a pathetic blue-collar kid playing dress-up in expensive scrubs. Bradley turned bright red, his face contorting with absolute fury. He lunged forward and slammed his fists down onto the marble island. He yelled that she was nothing but a broke social climber before Chimdhuman. He reminded her that she brought absolutely zero assets into their marriage, and that without his medical degree, she would be working the cosmetics counter at a cheap department store. He told her she was going to rot in federal prison and that he would not spend a single dollar of his money on her criminal defense. Monica did not back down. She matched his fury with a terrifying coldness. She leaned over the marble island, her eyes wide and completely unhinged. She told him not to act so incredibly righteous. She yelled that he had no right to play the innocent victim when she knew exactly what he had been doing with the clinic billing software. She screamed that if he thought he was going to walk away clean, she would gladly tell the federal investigators exactly how he had been desperately upcharging his Medicare patients to cover the massive holes in their operating budget. She threatened to expose every single fraudulent insurance claim he had filed over the past 6 months. The room suddenly felt incredibly cold. Bradley stopped screaming. The blood drained completely from his face, leaving him looking like a terrified ghost. He realized in that exact moment that his wife was not just a forged signature. She was a loaded gun pointed directly at his medical license. They stood there panting, staring at each other with pure, absolute hatred. The curated illusion of their perfect high society marriage was completely dead, replaced by the ugly, terrifying reality of two desperate criminals turning on each other. I stood quietly near the doorway, watching the monster I had raised, and the parasite he had married tear their entire world to shreds. I did not intervene. I did not stop them. I simply watched them destroy each other. Jonathan Reed stood beside me, his face completely impassive, carefully noting every single accidental confession of they were screaming at each other. They had spent years looking down on me, treating me like a disposable resource because of my faded work clothes and my calloused hands. Now they were completely exposing themselves as the absolute worst kind of trash. The ultimatum had worked perfectly, breaking their alliance and revealing the massive federal crimes hiding just beneath the surface of their pristine artificial empire. I looked at my son and realized there was absolutely nothing left of the boy I had sacrificed my life to protect. His core was entirely hollow. He was willing to sacrifice his own wife to save himself, but he was too arrogant and foolish to realize she held the keys to his own destruction. Monica stood there, breathing heavily, her chest heaving as she glared at the man who had just betrayed her. She told him that they were tied together permanently by their own greed. She swore that if she was going to wear handcuffs, he was going to be in the cell right next to her. The absolute silence that followed her threat was suffocating. I reached out and picked up the manila folder from the marble counter. I told them both that I had heard exactly enough. I turned around and walked toward the front door, leaving them trapped together in the beautiful, expensive house that was about to become their absolute tomb. I reached the heavy mahogany front door and wrapped my hand around the brass handle. Before I could even turn it, the door swung violently open from the outside. Standing on the expansive stone porch were 5 federal agents wearing dark windbreakers with bold yellow lettering printed cleanly across their chests. The flashing red and blue lights of 3 unmarked sport utility vehicles reflected off the pristine bay windows of the luxury house cutting through the quiet suburban evening. Jonathan Reed stepped up right beside me. He did not look surprised at all. He simply nodded to the lead federal investigator, a tall woman with cold, analytical eyes. I stepped aside and let the absolute reality of their actions walk right into their massive foyer. The heavy boots of the federal agents echoed loudly on the hardwood floors as they marched directly toward the open kitchen. Bradley and Monica completely froze. The venomous argument that had just been echoing off the marble countertops died instantly in their throats. Bradley looked at the federal agents, and his immediate survival instinct kicked in once again. He completely ignored the fact that his wife was standing right next to him. He rushed forward, holding his hands up in a pathetic gesture of complete surrender. He pointed directly at Monica and began speaking so fast, his words were tripping over each other in a desperate scramble to save his own life. He told the federal investigators that he was incredibly glad they were finally there. He loudly declared that he had just discovered his wife had committed a massive financial crime behind his back. He threw her to the wolves without a single ounce of hesitation, telling the agents that Monica had maliciously forged his signature and his father's signature to secure a luxury vehicle loan. He stepped away from her as if she were carrying a deadly, highly contagious disease. He proudly announced that he was fully prepared to cooperate with the federal government and provide any physical evidence they needed to lock her away in a prison cell. He actually smiled a pathetic, cowardly smile, genuinely believing he had just successfully outsmarted the entire legal system by sacrificing his wife on a silver platter. The lead investigator did not return his confident smile. She looked at Monica and recited the formal federal charges of aggravated identity theft and severe bank fraud. Two armed agents stepped forward and firmly grabbed Monica's wrists. They pulled her arms behind her back, and the sharp metallic click of the steel handcuffs echoed through the silent luxury kitchen. Monica did not fight them. She did not scream or cry. She simply stared at Bradley with eyes full of pure, unadulterated venom. She was completely broken, but she was patiently waiting for the second half of the execution to finally arrive. Bradley let out a long, heavy sigh of relief. He actually reached up and smoothed his pristine hair genuinely, believing his personal nightmare was finally over. He thanked the investigators and told them they could take his criminal wife away so he could begin rebuilding his life. But the lead investigator did not turn around. She did not instruct her men to leave the kitchen. Instead, she reached into the inner pocket of her dark windbreaker and pulled out a thick, folded legal document. She handed it directly to Bradley. He looked down at the paper, his cowardly, arrogant smile slowly melting right off his face. The investigator informed him that they were not just there to execute a simple arrest warrant for his wife. She told him that the heavy document he was currently holding was a comprehensive federal search and seizure warrant for his entire medical practice and his personal banking records. She explained that a highly detailed tip from a prominent corporate attorney had prompted them to look deeply into the clinic's financial ledgers earlier that morning. She stated perfectly clearly that when a federally insured bank loan application is flagged for severe forgery, the federal government automatically audits all of the primary businesses attached to the fraudulent applicants. Bradley began to shake violently. The document in his hand outlined a massive active investigation into gross Medicare fraud and illegal medical billing practices. The investigator did not whisper. She told him that their initial digital sweep of his corporate servers had already uncovered massive, undeniable discrepancies. They had found the exact fake invoices and inflated patient charges that he had been desperately using to cover the massive holes in his operating budget. She informed him that his medical license was immediately suspended pending a full federal indictment and that he was officially a primary target of the United States government. He dropped the warrant onto the marble floor. He looked at Jonathan Reed, who was standing quietly in the hallway. Jonathan simply adjusted his silk suit tie and stared back with eyes as cold as ice. Jonathan had not just reported the car loan forgery. He had legally handed them the entire corrupted financial anatomy of my son's fake empire. Bradley fell to his knees right there in his luxury kitchen. The reality of his absolute destruction finally crushed the last remaining breath of arrogance completely out of his lungs. He was going to lose his medical license, his massive house, his elite reputation, and his freedom. The federal agents pulled him up from the floor by his expensive tailored shirt. They slammed his hands behind his back and secured the heavy steel handcuffs around his wrists right next to his wife. They were permanently bound together now, not by love or respect, but by their own pathetic greed and massive federal crimes. The agents marched them both out of the kitchen, down the long, pristine hallway, and out the heavy front doors. I walked out onto the stone porch and watched the agents push my son and my daughter-in-law into the back of the unmarked vehicles. The heavy doors slammed shut, sealing them inside their terrifying new reality. The flashing red and blue lights pulled away from the circular driveway, leaving the massive luxury suburban house completely dark and entirely empty. I stood on the porch feeling the cool evening air wash over my tired face. The $600,000 was completely gone, but it had bought me the absolute and permanent truth. I walked down the stone steps and climbed into my rusted old pickup truck. I turned the key, and the heavy engine roared to life. I drove away from the wreckage of their artificial world, leaving the parasites entirely to the brutal, unyielding justice of the federal government. The sun rose over the commercial district the following morning, illuminating a completely transformed reality. The pristine luxury dental clinic that my son had so arrogantly bragged about was no longer a monument to his manufactured success. It was officially an active crime scene. The heavy frosted glass doors that were supposed to welcome local celebrities and corporate executives were now tightly wrapped in thick industrial steel chains and secured with heavy brass federal padlocks. Symmetrical rows of bright orange notices were plastered directly onto the expensive glass windows, explicitly declaring the commercial property seized by the United States government pending a massive fraud investigation. Inside the empty shell of the building, the glossy marketing brochures featuring Bradley's arrogant, smiling face were scattered across the scuffed marble floors. The custom artisan coffee bar and the $80,000 dental chairs were already sitting safely in my secure private storage facility. The vacant clinic now stood as a hollow, devastating monument to the severe consequences of unchecked greed. People walking down the busy financial sidewalk stopped to stare at the federal warnings taking out their phones to photograph the spectacular public downfall of the city's newest elite medical professional. The brand he had sacrificed his own father to protect was now completely synonymous with federal crime. While the commercial clinic was being permanently boarded up, the absolute destruction of their personal life was playing out in the bright daylight of their exclusive suburban neighborhood. The massive black luxury Porsche Cayenne that Monica had illegally purchased using my forged signature was no longer sitting proudly in their circular stone driveway. A heavy-duty commercial flatbed tow truck had arrived just after sunrise, accompanied by two federal marshals. The loud, aggressive grinding of the steel winch cables echoed through the quiet, manicured streets as the $150,000 vehicle was brutally dragged up the metal ramp. The exclusive country club parking pass, stuck proudly to the windshield, served as a pathetic reminder of the fake socialite lifestyle she had destroyed her freedom to achieve. The wealthy neighbors who Monica had spent months desperately trying to impress were standing on their sprawling lawns, watching the entire humiliating spectacle unfold. They whispered to each other from their expensive porches, completely horrified by the sight of armed agents tearing apart the illusion of the perfect high society family. The beautiful house itself was entirely dark and completely empty. The federal authorities had moved swiftly to freeze every single bank account associated with their names, leaving them without a single accessible dollar to hire private defense attorneys or post bail. Their massive social empire had completely evaporated overnight, leaving behind nothing but a massive crater of insurmountable debt and extreme public humiliation. The final and most devastating blow arrived exactly at noon. The State Medical Board, acting on the severe evidence provided by the federal investigators, issued an immediate emergency suspension of Bradley's medical license. He was officially stripped of his right to practice dentistry in any capacity, anywhere in the country. But the board did not stop there. Following strict legal protocols, they drafted a formal public notice of the suspension and mailed it directly to every single patient listed in his highly curated database. The local television personalities and the wealthy corporate executives who had attended his exclusive grand opening received certified letters informing them that their chosen medical professional was currently incarcerated and under active federal investigation for gross Medicare fraud and illegal medical billing practices. His name was immediately digitally scrubbed from every prestigious medical directory in the state. The brilliant visionary doctor had been legally reduced to a common criminal facing years in federal prison. His expensive custom-tailored white coat was permanently traded for a standard-issue canvas prison uniform. I spent that entire morning sitting quietly in Jonathan Reed's downtown law office finalizing the absolute reclamation of my commercial property. I did not feel a single ounce of regret or parental sadness. I felt the profound, unshakable peace of a man who had successfully surgically removed a massive toxic tumor from his life and his legacy. I had built my wealth through decades of pouring concrete, breaking my back, and honoring my contracts. I had used that exact same strength to completely dismantle the parasites who thought they could use my name to fund their arrogance. The absolute ruin of their fake empire was completely finalized. They had absolutely nothing left to leverage and nobody left to manipulate. It was raining heavily on Thursday evening when the final remnants of their artificial empire came crawling back to my front door. I was sitting in my living room reading a book when I heard a weak, frantic knocking against the heavy oak wood. I did not rush to answer it. I set my book down and walked slowly through the quiet house. I turned on the porch light and opened the door. Standing there shivering in the freezing downpour were my son and my daughter-in-law. They had been released on federal bail pending their formal indictments, but the government had frozen every single financial asset they possessed. They had absolutely nowhere else to go. The physical contrast between the two people standing on my worn wooden porch and the arrogant elite couple from 6 weeks ago was absolutely staggering. When Monica had called me to ban me from the clinic opening, she sounded like a powerful, untouchable socialite. She had spoken with a breathy, condescending tone obsessed with pristine aesthetics and high society branding. Now her expensive designer clothes were completely soaked and clinging heavily to her shaking frame. Her perfectly styled hair was plastered against her pale face and her expensive makeup was running down her cheeks in dark, ugly streaks. Bradley looked even worse. He was the man who had strutted around my living room demanding my money in a custom-tailored suit and designer loafers. Now he stood on my welcome mat, wearing a cheap, oversized hooded sweatshirt, looking like a terrified hollow shell of a human being. The untouchable visionary doctor was completely gone. Bradley looked up at me with wide, desperate eyes. He did not act like the superior intellectual who had mocked my decades of hard physical labor. He fell to his knees right there on the wet wooden boards. He reached out and grabbed the hem of my faded denim jeans. He called me Dad. It was a word he had not spoken with any genuine respect in over a decade. He began to beg with a pathetic, whining voice that completely disgusted me. He told me that his public defender was completely useless and that he was facing up to 10 years in federal prison for the Medicare fraud. He pleaded with me to liquidate my remaining retirement funds to hire a massive private defense team. He swore that he was a victim of his own ambition and that he never meant to hurt anybody. He frantically pointed at Monica, who was shivering next to the porch railing. He tried to sell her out all over again, completely ignoring the fact that his own illegal billing practices had ruined him. He claimed that her massive greed had forced him to commit the fraud to keep their lifestyle afloat. He begged me to let him move back into his childhood bedroom just until the trial was over. He promised he would get a minimum wage job and pay me back every single cent of the $600,000. He promised he would scrub my floors and cook my meals if I just saved him from the federal prosecutors. Monica did not fight back this time. The vicious venom she had spit in the kitchen was entirely gone. She was completely broken by the reality of her impending prison sentence. She stepped forward, holding her shaking hands together as if she were praying to me. She looked at my scuffed work boots and my faded flannel shirt. She did not sneer at my blue-collar aesthetic anymore. She begged me to forgive her for forging my signature. She told me she was terrified and that all of her wealthy country club friends had completely abandoned her. She pleaded for a warm place to sleep, claiming they had not eaten a real meal in 2 days because their credit cards were entirely declined everywhere they went. I stood in the dry doorway, looking down at the 2 miserable criminals crying on my porch. I did not feel a single drop of parental instinct urging me to reach out and pull them inside. I did not feel angry anymore. I felt entirely cold and perfectly clear. I looked at Monica first. I kept my voice incredibly low and steady, forcing them to listen to the absolute truth over the sound of the pouring rain. I reminded her of the phone call we had 6 weeks ago. I reminded her that she explicitly told me I was not allowed to attend the opening of the clinic I had built because they only invited close family and friends. I repeated her exact cruel words back to her. I told her that she was right to exclude me because we were clearly not family. Family protects each other from the storms of life, but parasites only try to find a warm body to drain when the weather turns cold. I watched Monica close her eyes and sob uncontrollably as the sheer weight of her own past arrogance crushed her completely. Then I looked down at my son. He was still clutching the fabric of my jeans, looking up at me like a terrified child. I firmly stepped backward, forcing him to let go of me. I told him that 6 weeks ago he believed he was a superior intellectual giant who did not need his uneducated father's advice. He had explicitly told me that my manual labor was a personal failure and that his advanced medical degree elevated him to a completely different level of society. I told him to use his superior intellect to defend himself in federal court. I informed him that I would not spend a single penny of my hard-earned concrete money to hire a lawyer to defend a man who actively stole from the sick and the elderly just to maintain a fake social image. Bradley let out a loud, pathetic wail. He begged me to remember that he was my only child. He cried that he was my flesh and blood, and that a real father would never let his son go to federal prison. I looked at him and delivered the final absolute reality of our relationship. I told him that I spent 40 years breaking my back, destroying my knees, and sacrificing my entire youth to ensure he would never have to struggle. I gave him every single tool he needed to build a magnificent, honest life. But instead of building a foundation, he chose to build a hollow monument to his own massive ego using stolen money and forged signatures. I told him that I did not put the federal padlocks on his clinic doors, and I did not force him to submit fraudulent insurance claims. He chose to commit those crimes entirely on his own, because he believed he was too important to follow the rules of normal working people. True love is not blindly shielding a criminal from the consequences of their actions. True love is allowing a man to feel the absolute crushing weight of his failures so he might eventually learn how to be a decent human being. The rain continued to pour down around them, washing away the last tiny fragments of their false reality. They stood on my porch, completely stripped of their wealth, their status, and their toxic arrogance. They had absolutely nothing left to leverage. They were just 2 desperate criminals facing the brutal, unyielding wall of federal justice. I looked at them one last time, memorizing the pathetic sight of the people who thought they could throw me away like garbage. I told them that my house was not a sanctuary for frauds. I stepped entirely back into my warm, quiet home. I grabbed the heavy brass handle and pushed the oak door forward. The loud, definitive click of the deadbolt locking into place echoed perfectly over the sound of the storm, permanently sealing them out of my life forever. I stood perfectly still on the dry side of the threshold, looking down at the two shivering figures huddled together in the freezing downpour. They had finally stopped screaming and begging. They were completely out of breath, their energy entirely depleted by the crushing reality of their impending federal prison sentences. The only sound left in the cold night air was the heavy rain violently lashing against the wooden steps of my porch and the pathetic, ragged sound of my son desperately gasping for air. I did not raise my hands to comfort them. I did not shift my weight or show a single ounce of hesitation. I wanted them to remember this exact moment for the rest of their miserable lives. I wanted the image of me standing tall and unbothered to be permanently burned into their memories, so they would always know exactly who had finalized their destruction. I looked directly into Monica's eyes first. The manufactured high society socialite, who had sneered at my worn-out boots, was now kneeling in puddles of muddy water, her expensive designer coat completely ruined. Then I shifted my gaze to Bradley. The arrogant, visionary doctor who had demanded my life savings as if it were his birthright was staring up at me with the terrified, hollow eyes of a defeated coward. I did not need to shout over the sound of the storm to make them understand their fate. I kept my voice incredibly soft, steady, and completely devoid of any parental warmth. I reminded them of the phone call that had started this entire devastating sequence of events. I spoke slowly, ensuring every single syllable landed with maximum impact. I told them that exactly 6 weeks ago they had made a highly calculated decision to exclude me from the most important day of their professional lives. I looked at Monica and repeated the exact words she had used to casually dismiss my entire existence. I reminded her that she had proudly claimed my blue-collar aesthetic did not match the pristine luxury environment they were trying to project to their wealthy friends. She had told me that my presence would only confuse their elite target demographic and severely damage their carefully curated image. I paused, letting the bitter memory hang in the freezing air between us. Bradley and Monica stared up at me, completely paralyzed by the cold truth of their own past arrogance. I took a slow, deliberate breath and delivered my absolute final judgment. I told them that they were absolutely right about me. I told them that I never belonged in their fake, artificial world built on stolen money and desperate lies. I looked my son dead in the eye and told him that my aesthetic did not fit his shiny new brand because my brand is accountability. They both froze completely. The sheer finality of that single word seemed to physically crush whatever tiny sliver of hope they had left clinging to. They finally understood that there were no more negotiations, no more pathetic excuses, and absolutely no more second chances. They were entirely on their own, facing the massive destructive consequences of the fire they had deliberately started. I did not say another word. I did not wish them luck or offer a tragic goodbye. I simply took a single step backward into the warm, quiet hallway of my home. I reached out and grabbed the heavy brass handle of the solid oak door. I pulled the door firmly shut, severing my connection to them forever. The loud, heavy metallic thud of the steel deadbolt locking into place echoed definitively through the house, signaling the absolute and permanent end of their reign. I stood in the entryway for a long moment, listening to the muffled sound of the freezing rain beating against the exterior walls. The absolute silence inside my home was profound and deeply comforting. I took off my damp jacket, hung it carefully on the wooden rack, and walked slowly down the hallway toward the kitchen. The air smelled of fresh, roasted coffee and warm wood, entirely contrasting the bitter cold desperation I had just locked outside. I walked into the kitchen, expecting to find it empty. Instead, Jonathan Reed was sitting calmly at my worn oak table. He had not packed his leather briefcase. He had not called for his private driver to take him back to his downtown corporate office. He was sitting perfectly upright, holding a silver pen in his right hand. A fresh pot of coffee was steaming on the counter beside him. Jonathan looked up as I entered the room. He did not ask how I was feeling. He did not ask if my son was still crying on the front porch or if the federal authorities had already arrived to collect them. We operated on a completely different frequency. We dealt in absolute reality and forward momentum, not emotional theater. He simply reached out and placed his hand flat against a thick stack of pristine white parchment paper. He slid the crisp documents across the scratched wooden surface of my kitchen table, stopping exactly where my coffee mug usually sat. I walked over and looked down at the first page. It was not another repossession order or a criminal referral. It was a brand new commercial lease agreement, completely drafted and perfectly formatted. I looked up at my lawyer and raised an eyebrow. Jonathan took a slow sip of his coffee and stated that leaving a fully equipped medical facility sitting completely empty was simply bad business. He informed me that he had already been in contact with a brilliant young professional who was currently drowning in massive student debt, but possessed a flawless medical record and a profound dedication to his craft. Jonathan tapped his silver pen against the new contract. He told me the young doctor was ready to sign immediately. I pulled out my wooden chair and sat down, feeling the immense satisfaction of a perfectly executed adjustment. The toxic parasites were completely eradicated, and the foundation was finally ready. 3 months later, the bitter cold of winter had finally surrendered to the early warmth of spring. I drove my old rusted pickup truck down the familiar streets of the commercial district, but the heavy feeling of anticipation that used to sit in my chest was completely gone. I pulled into the parking lot of the commercial building I owned. I did not park in the front row this time. I parked in a standard space near the side entrance, leaving the premium parking spots open for the people who actually needed them. I turned off the heavy engine and stepped out into the bright morning sunlight, taking a deep breath of the fresh air. The exterior of the building had been completely transformed. The bright orange federal seizure notices that had plastered the windows for weeks were entirely gone. The heavy brass padlocks and industrial steel chains had been legally removed. But the most significant change was the glass itself. The pretentious frosted coating that Monica had installed to keep the normal working-class citizens from looking inside had been completely scraped away by a professional cleaning crew. The massive, arrogant silver letters spelling out Bradley's elite cosmetic brand had been chipped off the brick facade, leaving absolutely no trace of his massive ego behind. In their place hung a simple, professionally painted wooden sign. It did not promise exclusive luxury or elite social status. It simply read, "Community Dental Care." The lettering was bold, clear, and completely unpretentious. I walked up to the front entrance and pulled the clear glass door open. The suffocating smell of expensive lavender oil and the pretentious classical piano music had been completely eradicated. The pristine, imported white marble floors were still there, but they were now sensibly covered by thick, durable entryway rugs to prevent people from slipping on rainy days. The space where the absurd custom artisan coffee bar used to sit was now occupied by a practical wooden reception desk and a simple waiting area. There were no imported white leather sofas meant to impress wealthy executives. There were rows of comfortable, sturdy vinyl chairs designed for actual waiting patients. A standard commercial coffee pot sat on a small side table next to a stack of basic medical magazines and local newspapers. It no longer looked like a 5-star spa designed to stroke the fragile egos of local celebrities and wealthy socialites. It looked exactly like what it was supposed to be. It was a clean, functional, and honest medical facility designed to actually help everyday people. The entire atmosphere felt incredibly grounded and deeply real. The toxic artificial energy that had previously choked the life out of the room had been completely sterilized. I stood in the center of the lobby, breathing in the clean scent of medical-grade disinfectant and fresh black coffee. I looked around the quiet, functional space and felt a profound sense of absolute peace. The massive financial investment I had made was finally being used for its intended honest purpose. The building was no longer a monument to arrogance and massive federal fraud. It was a solid, working foundation. I walked down the newly painted hallway toward the primary surgical suites. The heavy steel doors were propped wide open, inviting natural light into the sterile rooms. Inside, I saw the new tenant of Apex Commercial Holdings. His name was Dr. Richard Evans. He was a 32-year-old professional who had graduated at the absolute top of his medical class, but was currently carrying a massive mountain of student loan debt. When Jonathan Reed first introduced us, Richard had been working out of a cramped, rundown public health clinic, doing incredible reconstructive work for combat veterans who could not afford basic dental care. I had reviewed his financial history and his medical records with extreme precision. He was the exact opposite of the entitled parasite I had previously allowed into my building. Richard was wearing simple, dark blue scrubs. There was no expensive silver thread spelling out his name. He was standing next to one of the $80,000 operating chairs, speaking softly to an older man, wearing a faded military veteran baseball cap. I stood quietly in the hallway and watched him work. He did not treat the patient like a walking bank account. He treated the old soldier with absolute dignity and profound respect, explaining the details of the procedure in clear, simple terms. He finished the examination, shook the veteran's hand, and walked him out to the main lobby, personally thanking him for his service to the country. When Richard turned around and saw me standing in the hallway, his face immediately lit up with genuine gratitude. He did not puff out his chest or act like he was the most important person in the room. He walked over and firmly shook my hand. His grip was strong and slightly calloused, telling me that he actually worked for a living and did not spend his days getting expensive manicures. He looked around the pristine surgical suite and shook his head in absolute disbelief. He told me that he still woke up every single morning expecting this entire arrangement to be a dream. He thanked me again for the massive opportunity I had handed him. I had legally leased him the entire commercial building and all of the state-of-the-art medical machinery for a tiny fraction of its actual market value. The rent I charged him barely covered the property taxes and the basic maintenance fees. Richard told me that because he was not drowning in massive corporate overhead, he had been able to dedicate 2 full days a week entirely to pro bono work for local veterans and low-income families. He explained how the panoramic imaging machines and the hospital-grade sterilization units had allowed him to perform complex, reconstructive surgeries that these patients would never have been able to afford otherwise. He spoke passionately about his work entirely devoid of the toxic arrogance and desperate social climbing that had defined my son's miserable existence. I listened to his words feeling a deep sense of pride that my money was finally building something entirely real. I told Richard that he did not owe me any gratitude. I explained that in my decades of doing business, I had learned that providing the right tools to a man with a solid foundation is never a risk. It is an absolute privilege. I told him that the heavy, expensive machinery bolted to the concrete floor was completely useless without a skilled and honest pair of hands to operate it. I made it clear that he brought the actual value to the building, not the other way around. I told him I was proud to have my name attached to a facility that actually restored human dignity instead of just catering to local socialites and arrogant executives. Richard smiled a quiet, humble smile. He understood exactly what I meant. He did not try to flatter me with empty corporate buzzwords or promise me impossible financial returns. He simply looked me straight in the eye and promised that he would take perfect care of my building and my equipment. He told me he knew exactly how many hours of brutal physical labor it took to purchase those machines. He swore he would honor that immense sacrifice with every single patient he treated, regardless of their ability to pay. It was the exact level of mutual respect and absolute accountability that my own son had never been able to comprehend. Richard gestured toward the small break room down the hall. He apologized that he did not have an expensive artisan espresso machine or imported sparkling water to offer me. He said he only had a standard commercial drip coffee maker and some cheap ceramic mugs. I looked at the brilliant young doctor and told him that standard black coffee was the only kind I ever drank. We walked into the small break room together, leaving the quiet hum of the high-end medical machinery behind us. He poured 2 cups of the dark, steaming liquid and handed one to me. We stood there drinking our coffee in comfortable, quiet camaraderie. There was no tension, no arrogance, and absolutely no deceit. Just 2 hardworking men who understood the profound value of honest labor, mutual respect, and the unbreakable strength of a true foundation. I sat alone in the quiet waiting room of community dental care, holding the warm ceramic mug in both my hands. The heavy vinyl chair was incredibly comfortable. It did not squeak or shift under my weight like the imported leather furniture Monica had purchased to impress her wealthy friends. I took a slow sip of the standard dark roast coffee. It was not artisan espresso ground from imported beans. It was simple, honest coffee brewed by a hardworking doctor who respected the solid foundation he stood on. I looked around the lobby one last time, admiring the clean, functional space. The warm sunlight poured through the massive front windows, illuminating the room. For the first time since I wired that massive sum of money, I felt completely and entirely at peace. The building was finally breathing cleanly. My heavy, scuffed smartphone vibrated quietly against the wooden side table. I set my coffee mug down and picked up the device. The screen illuminated, displaying a breaking news alert from a prominent local business journal. The headline was short and incredibly direct. It announced the official trial dates for a disgraced local cosmetic dentist and his wife facing massive federal indictments. The brief article detailed the upcoming prosecution for severe Medicare fraud, aggravated identity theft, and gross bank deception. The trial was scheduled to begin in a federal courthouse early next month. The journalist noted that both defendants were facing mandatory minimum prison sentences and had been permanently stripped of their professional medical licenses and their personal financial assets. I stared at the glowing screen for a long moment, reading the clinical legal summary of the total destruction of my son. I did not feel a single drop of parental heartbreak. I did not feel the urge to call a lawyer or attend the court hearings to offer my quiet support. The boy I had broken my back to raise was completely gone, replaced by a hollow, arrogant parasite who had attempted to drain my life to fund his illusions. I did not need to witness his final sentencing to find closure. The true closure was the absolute silence in the room around me. I pressed my rough, calloused thumb against the glass screen and swiped the notification away entirely. I deleted the news alert, erasing their names and their self-inflicted tragedy from my daily reality with a single decisive motion. I picked up my ceramic mug and drank the last remaining drops of the bitter black coffee. I stood up from the comfortable vinyl chair and walked toward the clear glass doors. I stepped out of the clinic and into the bright, warm spring morning. The air felt incredibly crisp and clean, without the heavy stench of greed hanging over the property. I walked across the parking lot toward my rusted 1998 pickup truck. The faded paint and the dented steel doors felt like old, loyal friends. I climbed into the driver's seat and turned the key. The heavy engine roared to life, vibrating powerfully beneath my hands. I put the truck into gear and drove out of the commercial district, heading toward the open highway. The $600,000 had been a massive and incredibly expensive lesson, but as I drove down the road, I knew it was worth every single penny. It was the ultimate price I had to pay to permanently sterilize my environment and achieve the absolute unshakable peace I truly deserved. The greatest lesson I learned from dismantling my own son's fake empire is that unconditional love should never mean unconditional surrender. We are taught that family is a sacred bond that requires endless sacrifice, but when that blood turns into a parasite, sacrificing yourself only feeds the rot. True respect cannot be bought with blind financial support, and real legacy is never built on stolen foundations. You must have the absolute courage to let the people you love face the brutal consequences of their own arrogance. Sometimes the most profound act of love is simply locking the door. If you have ever had to cut off toxic family members to protect your own peace, tell me your story in the comments below, And make sure to hit that subscribe button for more lessons in absolute accountability.